Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. Dating in the late 1700s wasn't quite the same as it is today. In our next conversation with Dr. Mark Staker, we'll find out about how Joseph Smith Sr. met and proposed to his wife, Lucy Mack. And it's going to be a fun conversation. You won't want to miss it. We'll even talk about some of their wedding presents that were found. So Mark is the author of Joseph and Lucy Smith's Tunbridge Farm, and we're going to talk more about that book. Check out our conversation.
So Lucy then comes into the picture. Joseph meets her down in the village.
Joseph Sr.
Joseph Sr. meets her down in the village, where her brother introduces her to his customer, who was Asel. He introduces his sister, to his customer's son. And so that was how the two met.
And she was Lucy Mack, is that right?
She was Lucy Mack. Her brother was Stephen Mack. And at that time, you didn't just walk up as a young man to a young woman and say, "Hi, what's your name? Can I have your phone number?" That just was not done. You waited until you were properly introduced. Tried to follow through. This story has developed how Joseph Sr. and Lucy met. She was working in her brother's store, and they met somehow there. He came in to buy stuff. First, he wouldn't have just walked up and introduced himself to her that way. Second, young women didn't work as clerks in the store. I know in the TV series Little House on the Prairie, it happened, and it did occasionally happen. Husbands and wives worked together, but it probably wouldn't have happened in this circumstance for a number of reasons. One of them being that her brother didn't have a store right then. He starts that later, but he had a lot of other businesses, including a sawmill where Asa would come and get his lumber for his barrels. And so he introduces Joseph Sr. and Lucy Mack. And they get married and move into this home that we've been talking about, that Asa and Mary had their family in. The home had been expanded in size very early on. We guess probably the following spring after they moved there, just because there's not enough room for everybody to function in there. We know that the fireplace was built early. We know that windows were added to the home. We found some of the glass for at least two different windows, because the width of the glass was just a slightly different, so that we knew that there were two windows, but just some fragments, not many fragments. But so we know a few little of those details. The stoop of the home, where that was, and that they had a cellar. We excavated the cellar, which had survived largely intact. So, and Joseph and Lucy set up a household there with the Smith family that then moved. The following year, they're able to build a new home, and we didn't know much about that, but we want to try to figure out that story too. And that's where I mentioned before that George Edward Anderson had taken some photographs and said, here's where Hiram Smith was born. And we just couldn't figure out, how does that fit with this? How could he get that wrong? He was there 1907, just a century later. People would have kind of had a rough idea of, well, yeah, the Smiths lived here, so on. Did he just go way off?
So how much older was Hiram than Joseph Jr.?
Let's see, 3 years.
3 years, because I think Joseph was born in 1804, if I'm right.
1805.
1805.
Yeah.
And then, so Hiram would have been born in
1802. So he was born in 1800. Hiram's born in 1800.
Okay.
Yeah. I have to think through my history here. What's going on? So, Asel's born 2 years before him, and then Hiram's born 1800.
Okay. So Asa was the oldest brother.
And then Sophronia, the oldest sister, she's born in 1803. And then Joseph Jr. is born in 1805. So back to trying to figure out, the Smith family, meaning the Joseph Sr.'s mom and dad and siblings all move out. Where did they move to? What can we learn about the additional parts of this story? And we had those photographs taken by George Edward Anderson. We showed them to lots of the neighbors around there, old timers who'd been there 70 years or more. What can you tell us about this? And they'd say, well, I don't know. They couldn't really help much. But the last night, after we'd finished digging, kind of cleaned up a little bit, but we had a little bit more time. That's one of the things that we were still focusing on, and we went up the road a little bit to kind of look at Aisel and Mary's property more. And the family that lived on that property were very nervous about, we had a tape measure around, and we'd been measuring on along the road and things, and we'd gone, and the elderly owner of the property, we talked to her earlier a bit, but her grandkids were around, and others were really suspicious because there was a developer up there buying lots of land, and everybody was really nervous about what he was up to. And so we'd gone down and knocked, and one of them chased us off the property with his shotgun. And not very happy with us. I'm sure he wouldn't have used it. I think he was just trying to make a statement of just stay away from us. Whatever you're doing, don't want to be involved in it. But we had kind of already measured the fence lines around and kind of had learned what we could about Aisel and Mary's property from the deeds. And across the road there was a trailer home up in the trees, and we stopped by. The sun was setting, and we didn't have much more time, and thought, well, we'll just ask them, and knocked on the door, and I showed him the picture, and I said, do you know where this is at? And he kind of rubbed his head and shook it, and I said, no, I don't, sorry, I can't help you. And I said, well, okay, we're looking at that. And he said, hey, wait. He said, there it is, and he pointed right behind us. We were standing on the stoop as he was looking out his front door off to the scene, and said, and we turned around, and you could see it. The mountains were all there. The setting was all exactly the same, and it was Aisel and Mary Smith's property that George Edward Anderson had photographed.
Oh,
and we finally had that piece of the puzzle. That's why he assumed that Hiram was born there. He went and he took a photograph of the Smith property, but it was the wrong Smith family. It was Grandma and Grandpa, and not otherwise. And so that gave us one more detail.
okay.
The story, and it ended up putting that photograph on the cover of the book because it's so compelling. But it also suggests this is the family. This was their setting in which they had kind of developed, and the pinnacle of what they had been able to accomplish there in Smith settlement. That was the best of what they had, and so that detail came together to where we then understood kind of how the family had moved off of this home site and then let Joseph and Joseph Sr. and Lucy lived there, and so we had that part of the puzzle. As we first came to the site and were looking it over, trying to figure out what to do, I was taking a few photographs, and there were these posted signs, keep out, and everything. And I figured out, to find out who actually owns this property is not going to be easy, and what are we going to do? And this gentleman came walking up the road and wanting to know who we were and what we were about. And as we talked and I explained it ended up being Scott Beavers, who owned the property. And he and his wife, Patricia, gave us not only access, they let us use their wheelbarrow from their garden, to do kind of some initial stuff. We were just doing kind of some test work. Came back later, we were able to make a more detailed proposal to get a grant and come back and do more extensive work. But it just happened, had he not been walking up the road right when we were looking at, I'm not sure that we would have been able to figure out who owned the property. I suspect, as we talked to neighbors and everything, eventually we could have learned that. But so those details had all come together. We did an initial dig, found some early ceramics that said, yes, this was an early, late 18th century, early 19th century site, or at least they had ceramics from that period. It's something we can learn about. We were able to get a larger grant, got a lot of volunteers. The missionaries who were working over at the Joseph Smith Birthplace Memorial Site volunteered their preparation day time to come over and helped. A lot of people from the local ward in Royalton came to help. People from members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from various other wards came, and we got quite a few people helping. We even had some a family driving by on their vacation that came to see the site, and they parked their car and they came out and spent their vacation helping us dig. So it was a great experience as we continued to pull together all of the data. We focused just on the foundation. We didn't have the resources and the time to dig the whole site, so we just dug, right around the foundation and then the cellar within the foundation.
And this is just a 10 by 12 house, essentially, right?
Well, it started out 10 by 12. It expanded 24 by 24 feet.
Oh.
So we were able to figure out those details and the expansion that happened after they had initially settled there and had moved, and had expanded it all right before the family moved to the site just north of this. So we learned those details, where the kitchen was, some details about the kitchen and its hearth, and the cellar, details about that cellar. And then I spent a couple of chapters analyzing the ceramics. What do those ceramics tell us about the family?
One of the most interesting things to me, I actually lived in New Hampshire for about 4 years when I was pretty young, and you would see these rock walls all over the place. And you talked about that in the book. It just totally brought me back. Can you talk a little bit about those essentially fences that they?
Those fences still survive in areas. Those rock walls. A typical stringer fence where the rocks, the bottom portion, and then the wood rails are the top portion. The rails are all gone. Don't survive anymore. And we were able to document those, photograph them, their lengths, and what does that tell us about the nature of the property and how they used it, because there aren't rock walls in some places. And if not, what does that mean? Well, that means a worm fence, and you may have seen those worm fences that kind of wiggle back and forth like a snake crawling. Those were fences that could be moved. And why do you want to move a fence or have one that's immovable? Those are details that kind of tell you about how the land was being used and how they were farming or using it for animals and things. And so we looked at all that carefully. But the fences are, many of them are still in place, and it was helpful to look at those too. And you could say, Joseph Smith Sr. and his family built these, And then later on, when you go to Palmyra, you can see some of those same things there, and where they brought that from and what they're thinking while they.
I just remember seeing these fences everywhere that had no rhyme or reason, but it was just interesting because where did they get the rocks from? Was it just? Can you talk about how that?
The rocks are everywhere. They come up, and there's a great in the affidavits that Hurlbut gathers in Palmyra. Peter Ingersoll chides Joseph for saying that the sun brings the rocks up to the surface. Well, Vermonters weren't foolish people, of course. Why would they believe such a thing? Well, after they cut all the trees down in the forest, those roots of the trees would die away, and the rock that's all under the ground and broken up from centuries of growth of trees gets pushed up by the frost. And so it's during the winter that those rocks come to the surface, and then as the sun comes out in the spring, melts the snow, you have all these rocks everywhere. And it's a natural part of the process that then you go out and you clean those off of your field that you're going to plow, and you put those along the fence line, and they become part of the fence. And so that's how their stone fences originated, was trying to clear the fields out to plow them, but they served a lot of other purposes as well.
Yeah, they're all over New England, those little rock walls. It's amazing.
So Joseph Sr. and Lucy, after Joseph's parents moved out, they have this household where Asel's born, and the local surveyors come in and survey a road from the corner of the house at that time period when they just have their one son. But it gives us an exact location, exact in late 18th century terms, because surveyors weren't as exact as they are today. So it took us some figuring out. We had to measure, and that's partly why I mentioned earlier we'd been measuring along the road, and we're making one of their neighbors nervous as to what we were doing. We were trying to figure out those survey points based on that early survey. I think it was 1797, if I remember right. But it's in the book, but I have to remember exactly when that survey was done. But that helped us to get a corner of the building and confirm that it was their home, and then we were able to go from that to kind of figure out the details of the house, and some of the details of their lifestyle through the artifacts that we found. We found what turned out to be, I'm not an osteologist, Don isn't either, although he's much more brilliant than I am with all of these artifacts here. We didn't know what kind of bones we'd found at the site, but it turned out that they were all from deer, but from different deer. So we knew the family regularly hunted deer and ate deer, but lots of high-end ceramics. This was a family that was living very nicely for the time period, and would be considered respectable, maybe even upper middle class in their situation. And each artifact tells its own story, and so we looked through at each of those artifacts and what that told us about the family. At that same time, somebody over on the birthplace memorial site took a metal detector and was going over the site without permission and had dug up a spoon bowl. So that was put into the collection as well. We studied that, but that could possibly it dates to exactly the time that Joseph and Lucy got married. It could have been a wedding gift for them, and so we look at that. We can narrow it down to a 10-year time period, not an exact date, but within that 10-year period, it could have been something for them. So we look at each of those artifacts, try to see what they can tell us about the family.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Mark Staker. In our next conversation, we'll talk about Joseph Smith Jr.'s religious upbringing. Was he more similar to Joseph Sr. or Lucy?
Yeah, they're spiritual, but in very different ways. Lucy grows up, she's part of that great awakening that moves up the Connecticut River Valley. Joseph goes to those with her, but apparently to appease her more than anything. But he's religious, just in a different context.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please subscribe for just $5 a month at patreon.com. Gospel Tangents, and you can hear the entire interview before everybody else. If you'd like to watch the entire video for just $8 a month, you can either subscribe on YouTube, Patreon, or my website, gospeltangents.com. Just click the yellow subscribe button, and I'll add you to our Gospel Tangents Insiders group so that you can see entire videos. For those interested in a PDF transcript, you can subscribe at either Patreon or on my website. For just $10 a month, I'll send you a PDF as soon as it's complete. If you'd like a copy of the paperback as well as a PDF, just sign up for $20 a month at either Patreon or my website, gospeltangents.com. Of course, you can buy individual transcripts at Amazon.com and just do a search for Gospel Tangents interview, and you can see all the things that we have there. Don't forget to support Gospel Tangents with an awesome t-shirt like one of these. You can subscribe at Apple Podcasts at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents. Get our latest updates at facebook.com/gospeltangents. Also, you can get our Twitter updates at Gospel Tangents. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got more of our great videos. Thanks again.